God is Red, a native view of religion. 30th Anniversary Edition. Vine, Deloria, Jr. Fulcrum Publishing, Golden, Colorado. Foreword by Leslie Marmon Silko. Laguana Pueblo, author of Ceremony and Almanac of the Dead. No one who reads Vine Deloria Jr.'s books remains neutral. Vine's books influenced our generation and are as important to the United States cultural history as are books by Norman Mailer and Tom Wolfe. This will be appreciated by future generations when U.S. history ceases to be fabricated for the glory of the white man. What influenced me as a young writer was his defiant attitude toward the power elites, whether it be Christianity or the U.S. military. But Vine's was a special sort of defiance that depended on the warmth of Indian humor and the rule of international law, never the threat of violence. The publication of God is Red was anxiously awaited by all of us. Vine was our hero. Courageously and eloquently, Vine expressed what a great many of us Indians felt and thought. His writings spoke for generations past and generations yet to come. It took a great personal courage to speak out like Vine did back then. Remember, assassins took down Dr. King and Malcolm X in those years. I couldn't wait to see what Vine had to say about Christianity as the cause of the great weakness of the United States. Vine had identified America's great weakness in his 1969 bestseller, Custer Died for Your Sins. Consider the history of America closely. Never has America lost a war. When engaged in warfare, the United States has always applied the principle of overkill and mercilessly stamped out its opposition into the dust. Consider Vietnam, where the United States has already dropped more bombs than it did during the last war. A classic of overkill. But name, if you can, the last peace the United States won. Victory, yes, but this country has never made a successful peace, because peace requires exchanging ideas, concepts, thoughts, and recognizing the fact that two distinct systems of life can exist together without conflict. Consider how quickly America seems to be facing its allies of one war as new enemies. In God is Red, Vine explains how Christianity is the root cause of this great weakness of the United States. The inability to respect or tolerate those who are different. Clearly, this weakness of the United States has only worsened in recent years, with wars against former allies Manuel Noriega, Saddam Hussein, and Osama bin Laden, and friction with the French and Germans. Americans would do well to read God is Red again, to be reminded what happened in the 1960s and 1970s is the logic of Western culture and the meaning of the Christian worldview that supported the institutions of Western culture were outrun by the events of the time. Indeed, Christianity was so weak, God was dead. The Indian joke on bumper stickers was, "Hey, God is red. She isn't dead." God has always been red on these continents called the Americas, and God, Mother Earth God, and the religions of the indigenous communities of the Americas are alive and thriving. Vine points out the failure of the Christian conscience. We conducted a long war in Asia that was prolonged primarily for political reasons by two presidents. Yet both of these men were apparently Christians in good standing. Prominent church leaders such as Billy Graham did not call them to account as being anti-Christian or non-Christians for the wastage of human life. In the Gulf War, some church leaders did make an effort to prevent bloodshed, but their religious objections proved irrelevant to George Bush Sr. God is Red refuses to let the Christians off the hook. If the exploiters of old were not Christians, why did not the true Christians rise up in defiance of the derogation of their religious heritage and faith? At this point in the clash between Western industrialism and the planet's aboriginal peoples, we find little or no voice coming from the true Christians to prevent continued exploitation. As accurate and prophetic as it was 30 years ago, God is Red should be read and reread by Americans who want to understand why the United States keeps losing the peace war after war. We Indians? We don't disappear, but Deloria predicts the end of European expansion in the world and concludes, "Who will find peace with the lands? The future of humankind lies waiting for those who will come to understand their lives and take up their responsibilities to all living things, who will listen to the trees, the animals and birds, the voices of the places of the land, as the long-forgotten peoples of the respective continents rise and begin to reclaim their ancient heritage. They will discover the meaning of the lands of their ancestors. That is when the invaders of the North American continent will finally discover that for this land, God is Red." Foreword by George E. Tinker, Osage and Cherokee, Professor of American Indian Cultures and Religious Traditions, Iliff School of Theology, Denver. Coyote Old Man has always been a teacher, a wily man of the world who combines perspicuity, vision, and intuition with a sense of the ironic. Even in moments of feigned foolishness and individualism, Coyote is the people's teacher and is committed to their well-being. Vine Deloria Jr. is not Coyote Old Man, yet like Coyote, he is the commensurate teacher of whose sometimes outrageous intellectual gift to the Indian world has and still inspires young Indian intellectuals today. At the time of its initial publication, God is Red both systematized and gave voice to general American Indian thought. As such, it was and continues to represent an important first for Native people. It covers a huge intellectual waterfront, modeling a systematic, coherent Indian response to the fundamentals of Euro-Western historiography, philosophy, theology, social criticism, and political theory. But this book is more than a systematized introduction to American Indian thinking. In large part, God is Red is a critical reflection on Western thought and culture, an American Indian ethnography of Ameri-European intellectual and religious lifeways, if you will. As a result, the book's greatest contribution is that it seriously stirs the pot. Again and again, Deloria demonstrates the inadequacy of various Western modes of scholarship, offering shocking and almost scandalous new ways of understanding the evidence. At the same time, he demonstrates that his own hermeneutical reflection, extraordinary though it may seem, is actually no more preposterous than the generally accepted solutions offered in Western scientific and social scientific explanations of the world. Suddenly, the explanations offered by critical biblical and ancient Near Eastern scholarship for pyramid building in ancient Egypt, memorialized cinematically by Cecile B. DeMille, seem equally or even more fantastic and implausible than Deloria's own. Insofar as these so-called scientific explanations of the world have been used to signify American Indian existence in terms controlled and controllable by the settlers, colonizers in North America. Deloria's hypotheticals stand as a powerful and useful challenge. More to the point, in God is Red, Deloria makes minimal concession to explicit categories of cognition, common to those Western traditions, modeling instead the existence and articulation of enduring natural categories of Indian cultures themselves that are foundational for tribal existence and for tribal intellectual and religious traditions. Thus, The book continues to be a forceful challenge to the presumed inherent hegemony of the Western intellectual tradition. It is in this very exercise that the book began and will continue to teach many bright Indian youth, a future generation of Indian scholars, the validity of our own cultures, and the resources, categories of knowledge, and modes of discourse already at our disposal for reasoned analytical thought. The book's singular achievement, for instance, was its systematic and consistent analysis of the distinction between spatially and temporarity as culturally discrete ways of being in the world. In a sense, nearly every Indian person had already noted this important difference between tribal Native American peoples and the Amero-European settler population. Yet the difference was little discussed in the literature until Deloria finally and irrevocably named it. Likewise, Deloria spelled out the communitarian individualist difference between Indian and Euro-Western cultures. These category distinctions are now the foundation for any genuine analytical understanding of any particular Indian culture and for Indian intellectual thought in general. In God is Red, Deloria proposes an etiology for what he sees as a fundamental philosophical difference between tribal peoples and cultures. On the one hand, and others whom he describes as hybrid peoples, in typically provocative Deloria fashion, he demonstrates that a historical interpretation that assumes an alien invasion of a superior culture explains much of an ancient Near Eastern biblical history as well or better than the standard so-called scientific explanations. As wildly outrageous proposition to some, the point is that these same historical methods are used then by non-Indian scholars to interpret and explain American Indian realities. To put the matter boldly, from an American Indian perspective, if the assured results of the historical critical method of Western scholars are less than assured in dealing with their own sacred texts, then perhaps Indians are not so far off base in thinking that their scholarship about us is also suspect. Deloria's more philosophical theological work is not limited in its impact to Indian people, but continues to be instructive to those who function largely within the Western intellectual tradition. I fully expect that Deloria's continuing contribution to the American Indian scholarship will become increasingly important to the Academy and to the development and articulation of modern American Indian thought, outside of the Academy, where he taught so many years. Deloria's leadership has been freely given over time to both American Indian organizations and to non-Indian groups that have impacted or had the potential to impact Indian people. The guidance and support he continues to provide to younger Indian scholars is invaluable. God is Red amply shows an Indian intellectual mind at work. Anyone genuinely interested in the lifeways of American Indian peoples needs to read and indeed study this seminal work. Introduction. When I was very small and traveling with my father in South Dakota, he would frequently point out buttes, canyons, river crossings, and old roads, and tell me their stories. In those days before interstate highways, when roads were often two ruts along the side of a fence, it was possible to observe the places up close, and so indelible memories accrued around certain features of the landscape because of the proximity of the place and because of the stories that went with them. He seemed to remember details that other people had missed or never knew. He could point out buttes where vision quests were held, the hill near Standing Rock, where the women lived with the wolves, and obscure landings along the Missouri, where the people crossed, or where Jack Sully, shirt-tail relative and famous bandit, escaped from a posse. I came to revere certain locations and passed the stories along as best I could, although visits to these places were few and far between. It seemed to me that the remembrance of human activities at certain locations vested them with a kind of sacredness that could not have been obtained otherwise. Gradually, I began to understand a distinction in the sacredness of places. Some sites were sacred in themselves, others had been cherished by generations of people, and were now part of their history and, as such, revered by them and part of their very being. As the Indian protest movement gained momentum and attracted many young people to its activities, much of the concentration of energies was devoted to the restoration of sacred sites and the resumption of ceremonies there. God is Red did not receive much of a welcome when it hit the bookstores upon its release in 1973. And, since it was something of a departure from what I had written earlier, it was not even reviewed by most Indian journals and newspapers. Nevertheless, as people tried to give voice to the concerns over getting lands back and gaining better access to sacred sites located on public lands, the book provided a framework in which the demands for lands made sense. As important as the concern for lands was, the need for an affirmation that American Indians had their own tribal religious traditions and did not need to be homogenized among the other religions. I am most grateful to those people, Indian and non-Indian, who gave the book a chance and tried to see its message. Over the years, it has become useful to people of all tribes, and it is a handy place to find a quasi-philosophical view of what the sacred might mean to Indian people. Over and over, I encounter people who found the book to be useful to them in directing their path back to a more tribal and spiritual existence. The book has led me on in my search for a way to understand the power and spiritual capabilities of our ancestors. Reflecting back on the old men I observed as a boy and the utter sincerity of their belief, their humility, and hesitancy to rush forward with answers to important questions. In writing the book, I was led back to a great appreciation of our religious traditions. Since writing the book, I have been gradually led to believe that the old stories must be taken literally, if at all possible, that the deep secrets and a deeper awareness of the complexity of our universe was experienced by our ancestors, and that something of their beliefs and experiences can be ours once again. Black Elk, in his vision, saw many hoops of many people, and we always recognize that there are other traditions with their ceremonies, so that sacredness is not restricted to any particular group of people and their beliefs. Yet an examination of tribal traditions will show that Indian paths to an encounter with the great mystery of life were generally straight and fulfilling. Almost any tribe can be examined, and the result will be a bevy of stories about how the people use spiritual powers to live. And these powers are almost always made available to us in a sacred place, where time and space do not define the terms of the experience. Our perception of the physical world is in rapid change today, and many of the old stories about separate physical dimensions in which spirituality reigns supreme now sound possible, if not probable. I can now find justification and a possible explanation for the old stories that say a tribe came from the stars or emerged from some mysterious underground location. As I have gained knowledge and seen others share their visions with me, I conclude that our ancestors lived in a strange condition, in which they were in touch with the spirits constantly, and I see that as a goal for our present activities. Space, as defined in this book, is determinative of the way that we experience things. Time is subservient to it because, to have time, there must be a measurable distance to travel during which time can pass. Thus to say that the world has many sacred spaces, worlds under or within mountains, caves that come and go according to the kinds of ceremonies conducted at certain locations. These things now interest me, and I believe have attracted others to more closely examine our religious heritage. It is this unbroken connection that we have with the spirit world that will allow us to survive as a people.